Exactly as the brutal battle was being waged all along the line of contact, including within El Paso between the 48th Infantry Division of the PLA's 14th Group Army, now deep inside of El Paso after having done a preliminary enormous artillery barrage, now engaged in heated combat through the rubble-choked streets against the American 1st Armored Division's 3rd Brigade, along with aviation assets, particularly one attack helicopter battalion and one armed reconnaissance helicopter battalion, armed with Z-19 attack helicopters and Z-11WA armed recon helicopters, respectively, which, in addition to artillery fired from the PLA's 148th Artillery Brigade of the 14th Group Army, as well as the Divisional Artillery 2 battalions belonging to the 48th Infantry Division, had heavily smashed the city and the installation into total ruination, along with a myriad of various missiles and loitering munitions as well. The installation was completely, virtually annihilated by this point, even just mere minutes into the entire invasion as a whole, as on the far western flank, the PAP's 18th Light Armor Brigade had smashed its way into New Mexico, along with the PLA's 14th Group Army's 144th Armored Division, the heaviest unit with the most punch out of the whole 14th Group Army, which as of the moment wasn't even committed to any of the fighting and totally bypassed all of the combat in a bid to secure the Las Cruces area where I-10 and I-25 come together, as the I-25 route in particular was the main invasion route that needed to be secured by the externals at all cost in order to keep to their very stringent timetable of advance. Nothing could be permitted to impede this whatsoever at all, including the Americans, whose brigade commander over the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division had ideas of his own. And his intent, as all of the forces throughout Fort Bliss were just beginning to arm up and get in their vehicles after having done pre-maintenance services and checks in their respective motor pools, preparing to do a series of various live fire exercises and battalion-level drills throughout all the training areas, while the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade itself set up all of its Patriot and THAAD systems, respectively, within the training areas. While that occurred, the communications, the ISR, were completely rid of by that point, as midnight struck and the hard kill anti-satellite weapons, the DN2s and DN3s of China, S-500s of Russia, and others crashed into all American military satellites within just the first volley, with commercial satellites following. The Americans completely lost their eyes, proverbial eyes and ears, as it related to the battlefield. As this was occurring, the fighting began immediately, with Tu-95 MSM variants launching 128 cruise missiles total between all 8 aircraft of their bomber squadron assigned to just this area, with 100 of them alone going for Fort Bliss, mainly as part of the SEAD, or Suppression of Enemy Air Defense Operation, as these were long-range standoff cruise missiles that had a much further range than even the Patriot systems themselves even had, as well as sending 28 of their KH-55s and even more advanced stealth KH-101 long-range subsonic cruise missiles further north to aid the 8th Combined Arms Army operating within the Sante Fe area, currently rapidly capturing northern New Mexico and parts of southern Colorado, including Sante Fe in New Mexico, the state capital. Similar to how the Pakistani's 176th Missile Regiment fired their Babur A-1s in support of their other forces, the 18th Pakistani Infantry Division, which itself was a Trojan unit along with the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade of the Iranian Regular Army, which were operating to capture Albuquerque as well as the Kirtland Air Force Base within the city itself. Similar to how the International Airport was adjacent to the air base in Albuquerque, so too was the International Airport in El Paso adjacent to Fort Bliss. And the International Airport was a key objective, as well as securing the interstate, of the 48th Infantry Division of the PLA. With generous support from their own aviation assets, these very same aviation assets, within mere minutes of flying into American airspace, totally neutralized a large civilian pocket of roughly some near 280 armed civilians, rapidly emerging as the first shells and rockets began to fly in, startling many people from their sleep and causing them to grab their weapons, oftentimes on their nightstands or beside their beds. As of lately, with the international tensions and living so close to the border, many people in the city were well armed, as well as the area as a whole, as in many other border regions. As this occurred, the Chinese allies, Pakistan, and their respective Trojan forces belonging to the 14th Pakistani Army Infantry Division all broke out of their CCP regime properties, as China, of course, allowed their allies to base their forces on their strategically purchased and placed properties for the invasion. And their reconnaissance battalion of helos and their attack helo battalion both not only destroyed 2 American tank companies that were on the outer fringes of the roughly 17-mile-long line of contact, but they were also sending some of their other subordinate companies from each battalion to lend generous fire support to their Pakistani allies, their Trojan allies within just this area, who began on CCP properties just to the slight northwest of El Paso city limits. As upon breaking out of their CCP regime properties to go for their main objective, which was Fort Bliss and the main post, these 2 battalions and their subordinate companies comprising them both charged towards the installation in a rolling arrow formation, with each battalion in a rolling arrow formation as its subordinate companies created a arrow type of formation as shown in previous battle videos. And they raced through the rubble-choked streets of northern El Paso as they went for the post. And their lead company smashed through the fencing, which was flimsy chain-link fencing for the most part, topped with simple barbed wire strands instead of concertina wire, as that was one of the aspects of being set up for total failure, was that a border installation was not far more heavily fortified than it actually was. Instead of being more like a fob with large HESCO walls topped with rolls of C-wire and concrete T-walls and more, this was just a simple flimsy chain-link fence, and wasn't exactly a fort like the name implied, like most American installations, domestically speaking, within CONUS or the continental U.S. Right off the bat, within the main post, there was the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, as they had recently mounted up in their vehicles, most of them anyways. Some of them were lacking vehicles and hadn't as of yet gotten into them, so there was mass panic and confusion when the first rockets and artillery shells began to impact on the installation, mixed with the enormous array of various different cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes as well. It was a savagely vicious assault. And all along the base perimeter of the post, of this army post, of this active army post of Fort Bliss, Trojan units of the 14th ID of Pakistan's army were smashing through the White Sands range to attack the northernmost training areas where there were units doing live fire training, as in the whole 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division were all out at the ranges doing live fire training exercises as well as battalion level maneuvering exercises to boot. In the south on the main post and in Biggs Army Airfield just to the very north, this area was held by the 1st AD's 2nd Brigade and its subordinate battalions comprising it and its HHC, its Headquarters of Headquarters Company, which these command and control elements of the whole brigade, its independent HHC company, as well as the headquarters and support companies of each and every battalion, all had their own special battalion-level buildings and brigade-level structures, as well as a divisional headquarters for the 1st AD. There was also a brigade headquarters over the whole 11th ADA Brigade, Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and so on and so forth. These command and control centers were hit relentlessly by cruise and ballistic missiles of the tactical variety, as well as shells, mostly longer-range, satellite-guided, precision, rocket-assisted shells fired by the Chinese, their 155 WS-35R, long-range rocket-assisted projectiles that were satellite-guided, which smashed into buildings, into motor pools, and the buildings included, of course, the command and control areas, headquarters buildings and such, as well as communication hubs and more. Not that the communication hubs mattered, but it was done more out of SOP than anything else, as nothing was left to chance, even though the enormous mass cyber attack had shut down the military networks and the grid along with it, and telecom and the net within American soil. Certain protocols had to be maintained as it pertained to standard operating procedures around striking enemy targets, including command and control facilities, communication centers at the unit levels all the way up. So at this engagement, as these two battalions, a Combat Engineer Battalion of the Pakistani 14th Infantry Division and one of its Mechanized Infantry Battalions, in their rolling arrow formations, broke their arrows apart and began to attempt to surround these forces of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st AD. Greeting them at the main post just within the fence was its cavalry battalion and one of its 2 heavy battalions, its 2 tank battalions, as well as the HHC already being struck by an array of missiles within its headquarters buildings, although some of its personnel had already made it to their vehicles and fled the buildings as soon as the first artillery strikes began to light up around the post and outside in El Paso, merely a mile away from their current location. As these battalions advanced, they were attacked on their flanks by a tiny group of armed civilians, just under 200 of them, who coalesced in northern El Paso and tried to strike a few companies on the flanks of the Rolling Arrow, but they were brutally repulsed by the Al-Fahd infantry fighting vehicle versions as well as the APC versions. Now, the Al-Fahd was a Saudi Arabian, brand new APC and IFV. It was sort of like the Chinese wheeled WZ-551. It came in an APC variant and a IFV variant. Now, this Saudi wheeled armored fighting vehicle, either APC or IFV, came with a 40mm auto cannon controlled by a gunner inside the vehicle instead of a turret gunner. 40 millimeter. It was a very powerful autocannon with a 7.62 by 51 millimeter coax, and the IFV version, similar to how the Chinese ZBD-04A had a very powerful 100 millimeter main gun adjacent to its 30 millimeter autocannon, literally, essentially, for all intents and purposes, connected to it as a sort of coax weapon and a coax 7.62 by 54 millimeter machine gun. This Fahd IFV version had a 105 millimeter main gun and a 7.62 by 51 millimeter coax. The coax being the same system on the APC and IFV versions. The combat engineers likewise used these Fahds, as due to Pakistani military procurement, they procured weapons from all around the world, but still worked in such a way to where all their different battalions were standardized as it pertained to certain vehicle types, and this Fahd was no exception for their infantry battalions, as they had purchased many of these vehicles from Saudi Arabia. Their armored forces of the infantry division were all tracked-based, meaning they used tracked vehicles such as their Chinese-designed and built, also Pakistani license-built now, Al-Khalid main battle tanks, which were essentially a Chinese Type 90 model -2, which was essentially a Type 88C with some more upgrades on it for all intents and purposes, which is China's third best tank, which is still an incredibly modern and effective main battle tank, but the Pakistanis bought it and renamed it the Al-Khalid in their service, and they now produce the Al-Khalid 1 within their Taxala factory, which was modernized by the Chinese, their allies, and now can produce Chinese designs as well as new and innovative Pakistani designs incorporating aspects of Western and Chinese designs, such as their new Viper infantry fighting vehicle being based off the Saad chassis, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, a clone of the American M113 APC, which they also bought ample amounts of during the Cold War. As they smashed through the fencing and their rolling arrows began to break through and start to encircle these units in company size, there was a segment of the fighting that became extremely intense between the Cav unit with a few of its heavy companies and a rifle company near the housing area that was built adjacent to two streets with a fence and a park right here. There was a row of homes that was smashed immediately by the tandem cruise and ballistic missile strikes in the area, which these are all cruise and ballistic missile strikes that totally ravaged this entire area. This being a 1 kilometer by 1.5 mile long map. This is Chinese 300 millimeter rocket fire, which is totally saturating this area and off the map as well. A 1.2 by 1 kilometer area being saturated by 300 millimeter rockets, with Chinese howitzer artillery fire from their long-range rocket-assisted satellite-guided precision WS-35-R shells, which are being fired from the divisional artillery of the 48th Infantry Division, as it is much closer to the main post than is the 148th Artillery, which has to fire their rocket artillery, their long-range rocket artillery of the PHL-03 battalion into the installation in support of their allies, the Pakistanis. Also, there are enormous amounts of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles striking the area. Essentially, the Russian Tu-95s, again, fired a total of 128 missiles, 64 Kh-55s and 64 Kh-101s, and 28 went further north into New Mexico to aid their forces in Sante Fe, their Trojan Russian forces of the 8th Combined Arms Army, while the other hundreds struck various positions throughout the installation, many in the training areas as part of the SEAD missions, but certain command and control centers were also targeted, sometimes redundantly, as 3 different nations were trying to coordinate all of their missile fire, and occasionally they hit the same target a few times, with this Russian Kh-55 cruise missile on the very end here coming in, with a Iranian Shahab-2, a Chinese DF-2, and a DF-15B, as again, the Chinese missile forces were bolstered in strength by mobilizing some of their reserve battalions to essentially create reinforced brigades, which had several additional battalions apiece, which fired some of the older missile systems, or the more numerous ones, such as the DH-10A, long-range subsonic cruise missiles, while the newer and more advanced missiles were fired by the active Strategic Mssle Forces elements, like the DF-15B, for example, or the DF-21A, or the DF-11, or the DF-100 hypersonic cruise missile, which was likewise fired into the installation among the myriad of different missiles, to mainly earmarked for the SEAD missions to hit the Patriot and THAAD missile batteries, along with the Russians earmarking their Kinzhals, the KH-47s, strictly for the SEAD operations fired by their MiG-31K strike aircrafts. Now, there are various helicopter-fired anti-tank missiles, like the HJ-08s fired from the Z-19 attack helicopters. There's the same being fired from the armed reconnaissance helicopters, the Z-11WAs, which are also even firing the very potent CM-502KG anti-tank/anti-ship missiles. These are a dual-purpose missile. They can destroy heavy armor on the battlefield, or they can even be fired at shipping. And they're very powerful for being able to strike both types of targets. And the combination of these CM-502KGs and HJ-08s fired into the installation from just outside in El Paso, a few miles away, were done to aid the Pakistanis, who recently just smashed through the fencing about 15, almost 20 minutes into the entire battle, while artillery and missile strikes were nearly ubiquitous all throughout the area. This is only one tiny segment of the much larger battle occurring all along the perimeter of the post, and inside of it is these Trojan Pakistani shock forces smash their way in, as shown. Again, 300 millimeter heavy rocket artillery strikes, various cruise and ballistic missiles of the tactical ballistic missile varieties, conventional warheads, already having had impacted within mere minutes of the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strike, as well as the electronic warfare of the 14th Signals Regiment's Electronic Warfare Battalion, jamming the American communications, their redundant communications like their SINGARs and other types of communication systems. And of course, loitering munitions, the CH-901As, were set to AI piloting as more and more waves of these were fired, as there were ample vehicle targets that needed to be eliminated, as yes, the motor pools were indeed being struck by various cruise and ballistic missiles, but there were still a fairly large number of American vehicles that were out and about and not still stuck within their motor pools, being maintained, having maintenance done, or doing their final pre-maintenance services and checks before rolling out for their training operations that they originally had planned. So here are your HJ-08s or your CM-502KGs. And they're striking this tank here, this tank here, this tank here, this tank here, and this tank here that can be seen as well. Yeah, this tank, this tank, this, and this, and this one. This one was likewise destroyed by literally being within such close range to the rocket strikes and also being hit by fire from Pakistani IFVs from roughly, that's about 800 meters away, firing their 40 millimeter autocannons with armor-piercing ammo. Some were firing their HE ammo, while others were firing, the IFV versions were firing the 105 low recoil guns at the tanks. And the combination of being hit by so many types of munitions blasted the tracks off, along with the shrapnel from all the rocket artillery saturation, doing bad damage to the rear of the vehicle, as that was one of its least armored portions, as well as the roofing, of course. And the vehicle was quickly made combat ineffective. These Pakistani infantry troops operated in terms of their small arms, the Chinese Type 56 rifle as their standard rifle. Again, that is an AK-47 copy from decades ago that the Chinese passed down to other third-rate units, but the Pakistanis still use it for the most part as their frontline service rifle. It fires a 7.62 by 39, and it is the most widely produced version of the AK in the entire world, built by the Chinese clone of the AK, the Type 56. And the Pakistanis use it as their primary service rifle, although they are introducing their newest rifle, which is also a 7.62 by 39 for ease of logistical purposes due to the ammunition stocks they have being in that caliber, the PK-21, which is essentially an upgraded AK-47. And their light machine gun is the Chinese RPD copy, which is the Type 56-1 light machine gun. The RPD essentially is like a M249, but it is a 7.62 by 39 belt-fed, drum-held 200 round or 150. You can add the more ammunition to the belt on it due to the way the links work. It's a belt-fed light machine gun similar to a M249, which fires the 5.56 that our armed forces uses. The main advantage the Americans had in terms of man-to-man was that their small arms were essentially longer ranged and more accurate at a longer distance than these Pakistani infantry forces, who generally had to get closer in terms of firefights to be able to use their firearms more effectively and accurately, as from a distance due to ballistic reasons, the 7.62 by 39 was much heavier and would drop a lot sooner. So from about 800 meters away from, say, if there was a man-sized target, from that far away, they're really not going to be able to hit them with their small arms from that distance, hence the need for them to close on their enemy, to fire more accurately, and to make the most of their small arms. They did have a very powerful anti-tank weapon available that they had procured from Spain called the Al-Qaton, which was a 100 millimeter unguided, although it had an aiming system that was quite advanced. It was a detachable high-tech aiming system which had a ballistic computer and laser rangefinder, although the missile and the tube itself were disposable, meaning it was a fire-and-forget missile, as they call it. You fire at one time and throw away the tube, but you could reuse the aiming device, and that could be removed from the tube. These were very powerful, and they were almost like a bridge between classic light anti-tank systems like RPGs or the recoilless shell called the AT-4, which is essentially a recoilless shell. It's not a rocket like the RPG. It was like a bridge between those types of weapons and full-on guided anti-tank missiles, being that it could be aimed with a ballistic computer type device, which made it far more advanced than a standard RPG, which the Pakistanis also used the Chinese RPGs as well, the Type 69s, but they also brought the Al-Qaton to the fight, and it was definitely powerful enough to destroy an Abrams. It could penetrate 700 millimeters of RHA with its tandem charge warhead, although it wasn't a wire-guided or any other type of guidance. It was a aimed weapon. It was an unguided aimed weapon, but the aiming was advanced in the sense that it had a ballistic computer and a laser rangefinder to ensure accurate targeting. And these weapons were used to great effect in this fighting, all as they received generous support from the Chinese attack and armed reconnaissance helos, while these Fahd AFVs and APCs sat back and used their fairly long-range weapons and fired in support of their troops, while their troops moved ahead to support them, as in moving ahead to try to eliminate vehicles that had powerful anti-armor systems, including the M1 tanks, comprising hunter-killer teams, as it's called, whereby the forces that had these anti-tank systems were specifically moving ahead to look for tanks, to get the tanks before the tanks could get their vehicles. Essentially, this was a very important tactic for this type of fighting, because the objective of this battle, again, was speed and surprise, shock and awe. With the immense amount of missile strikes from conventional tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, as well as the artillery from the large satellite-guided, rocket-assisted, long-range 155mm artillery, such as here, and the enormous saturation of the massive 300mm rockets, along with the tactical ballistic missiles, this Al-Shahab, this DF-2, this DF-15B, this Russian air-launched cruise missile, this KH-55. There were Chinese DH-10As, which are subsonic cruise missiles, and DF-100s, which were the hypersonic cruise missiles, which maneuvered at a high rate of speed and unpredictable flight trajectories, although it didn't really matter at this point because, again, there was no ISR capabilities, no way to intercept these systems, these hypersonics. Same with the Kinzhals that the MiG-31Ks fired at the THAAD batteries. All in all, this was an enormous barrage, something that even the wildest imagination of many couldn't have even fathomed before this occurred. The vehicles and troops moved up slightly, as the vehicles didn't want to let the troops get too far ahead without being able to provide them some kind of fire support, as there were enormous rubble piles that were formerly buildings, and in order to be able to see through or around them, they needed to maneuver into place where they could get a good visual of what was ahead insofar as targets. As again, this battle on the installation functioned very much like classic urban warfare. As you see, this is just one little image of the larger battle. These are some of the smashed houses. You can see the blackened, charred grass in front of these buildings. You can see this guy's firing an Alcaton, a tube-based rocket, anti-tank rocket system, large 100mm rocket, and it had its advanced ballistic computing mechanism as a sighting mechanism on it. The guy's using, see the backblast shooting out of it as it fires it out before the motor ignites, and then starts trailing like a rocket. There's a large artillery crater from where a direct hit from a 155 shell blasted a huge chunk of pavement out of the road and cracked a street for meters. The KIA American soldier, there's an American M113 on fire, riddled with holes too. The crew serve has been completely blown off of the top of it, just a little place where you pin in the machine gun. It's all that's left. It's on fire. These M113s were sometimes referred to as a rolling matchbox because they could catch fire quite easily due to the composition of the armor, with a lot of aluminum within the armor being flammable in certain situations. These Pakistani troops with their night vision goggles on, running with their Type 56 rifles in a wedge formation, running over the rubbled house. There's a guy here, a point man up here, another. This is only a half squad too. And this is the burning vehicle, 2 KIAs. This is a gutted building right here, a gutted large barracks building. You can see the walls like spilling out here, the walls spilling out, and you can see the floor on the second floor here, and it's got a piece missing from it, and you can see the holes in the walls back here from where those were blown out, and you see walls that still propping up part of the second floor. Smoke from the fires here. KIA that was hit in the head here in the street. Yeah, this fighting was savage. I mean, this is like very, very intense combat, like urban type combat here in the installation. That specific scene occurring right here, where this vehicle at the initiation of the map is already destroyed. It was destroyed by the Pakistani IFV version of their Al-Fahd, firing its 105 millimeter cannon and blasting a huge hole in the front of this APC and blowing the crew serve off of it, catching fire. That happened right here before these troops, this whole squad, 5 and then another 5, all formed up behind them into a rolling T formation so that they could check the top of the building here as a rolling T. You have the 3-point man, and one on the left checks upwards on the left, and the one on the right checks upwards on the right, and the guy in the middle checks ahead. He scans ahead. As this fighting was going on, the CH-901 loitering munitions, as well as 81 millimeter mortar fire from Pakistani LLR-81, which are French mortars that they procured for their military. Their infantry battalion had a mortar company, which fired these mortars in support of their troops. These are mortar impacts, like on the other battle maps that have been shown. This squad running down the street, and some semblance of organization has been mostly eliminated by these mortars here and here. And these guys in the middle survive, but they're being engaged by the blast. They're injured. A few KIAs here, circled in orange, means the Pakistanis got them. These have red because the Chinese 300 millimeter rocket is throwing shrapnel and debris, engaging these inadvertently in the back of this tank here that's still functioning, with more Chinese artillery to fly in and hit and finish off these vehicles here, either destroy them or cripple them so badly that they can't even be used. All of these X's and circles, these are where Chinese artillery strikes are imminently flying in, along with the Russian cruise missile here. You see this grouping of troops running this way. This arrow is surrounded by red for the Chinese missile impact of their DF-2, which causes a huge blast, as the DF-2 can carry quite a conventional payload, carry over a ton. And there's purple around it from the Al-Shahab-2, which can also carry a pretty good payload, and there's also blue from the Russian cruise missile here coming in from their Tu-95. These surrounded by red, because as soon as these guys get to this point, this missile's already impacted this DF-2. It's cratered this whole area with this Al-Shahab-2. The Russian cruise missile is just a follow-up missile on this area. Like I said, they all had to coordinate their strikes, and occasionally they'd send a few missiles to the same target from these 3 different countries, Iran, Russia, and China. This is a DF-15B, newer tactical ballistic missile hitting this building. This whole area is a cratered wasteland. This was a battalion headquarters area. The HHC over the whole brigade is further off the map a little bit. Now, these are all barracks buildings and battalion level buildings. This is a battalion administrative area right here. These are like battalion command buildings and whatnot for the different brigades within the 1st AD. There's also the 11th Air Defense Artillery that has its own buildings on the post as well as the 5th Armored Brigade, which is a training unit, which also participates in this battle to a degree, although most of their troops haven't made it to their weapons within their armories because they never had the time to go and sign them out. Some did, but most didn't. So there were also rear detachments from other units on the installation who were left behind from deployed units that were gone off the post, like the aviation elements that were normally operating out of Biggs Army Airfield, which is just to the north of this battle space, in a different battle space, which will be shown in a later video, and other rear detachment units. And many of them were wiped out in the initial missile barrage and artillery barrage, surrounded by violet and red because these Al-Shahabs are coming in to hit these buildings here, as well as these CH-901A loitering munitions crashing into them, these tanks, these M1A2s. These vehicles, immediately upon showing this map, there's a lot of things going on all at the same time, even from the moment I showed this map. This vehicle was hit by a CH-901A, this MRAP, this Max Pro MRAP here, of this headquarters platoon of this armored company here, along with this Al-Shahab hitting this building and also destroying these vehicles. There's Pakistani mortars landing. They got direct hits and destroyed this LMTV and this fuel truck. These two landed right there and destroyed those two vehicles, these 81mm mortars. And also KIA'd this lead guy running down this two-column here, this staggered column of troops here. KIA'd the lead guy. There's also artillery being called in. There's a WZ-8 high-flying recon drone, even flying over the areas of Pakistani operations to relay intel to the Pakistanis, as well as updating their own combat data links within the PLA, to call in artillery strikes at the behest of the Pakistanis to aid them in their conquest over this installation. So the Pakistanis, although speed and surprise, they smashed their way into the base and are right now fighting the forward units here that are engaging them, like these different platoons of tanks and these rifle company platoons from the Cav Battalion. This is a very small area of a larger base, so these are like platoon level battles showing at the very most like company size elements. Like this is just one of the Pakistani Mechanized Infantry Companies right here. 15 of their IFVs and APCs with their headquarters units further back and off base where they were a bit safer from the battle, as these M1A2 tanks had very good range from their 120mm L44/55 Rheinmetall American produced copies. They had good range with that. And due to the fact that they had no military networks, they could only fight what they could see. So keeping their other forces, their lighter platoons, their headquarters forces and support forces, logistical type elements and command off the map was the most wise decision that could be made. This whole area is about to get annihilated by artillery. These mortars are hitting, eliminating these individual troops. They're being called in by the Pakistanis who are getting their intel from the Chi-Coms, from their drones. Pakistanis aren't a very drone-heavy army. I mean, they have drones, but they don't operate them at every squad, at the squad level like the PLA, or not even really at the platoon level. I mean, they may have some at the company level or higher, but, mostly they're using the PLA's drone and combat data links for their intel from which they can launch attacks. They also use more primitive radio systems than the PLA as well, but the PLA and the Pakistanis can patch into each other's radio systems. The Pakistani army is going through a lot of upgrades, and that included China revamping their whole defense industry for them, including their new 4.5 generation fighter jet that Pakistan and China both possess, that China designed and built, the JF-17. Pakistan flies those as well, and that was part of an effort at modernizing their air force, as well as their tank fleet being Chinese tanks. They just got the new VT-4 tank that China produced, getting that in batches, as well as their older Al-Khalid, which is still a very capable main battle tank. These forces advancing, dismounting from their APCs and IFV versions of their Al-Fahd, their wheeled armored fighting vehicles, getting behind these rubble pile homes, splitting their squads in two, 5 apiece here and here, here and here, here and here, are now rapidly advancing within mere minutes of having smashed into the installation. These guys are in a line formation, firing down this, where these buildings split here. They're firing across this courtyard at anything that shows itself on the street, while these guys move in a rolling T formation, walking through the rubble, gutted building, looking through the different floors as they can see inside the building as it's gutted, dilapidated, as well as looking on the top for any enemies that might be on top trying to snipe or throw grenades or anything like that. As these dismounted troops are running to take cover behind this enormous crater in the prone position in a wedge formation, as well as these two half squads going around this now smoking hulk of a destroyed battle tank with its turret completely blown off the top of it from being hit by this HJ-08 anti-tank missile, although they are going to hold their position because this entire place right here is just completely impassable, meaning they can't pass through this area due to the enormous amount of craters from all the different cruise and ballistic missiles that hit just this area of barracks and command buildings as it relates to company level and battalion level. And these houses are all totally smashed of these on-post housing areas right here, this line of homes on either side of this street, a street on either side of it. And the fence is just beyond this field right here, this park-like field. And these forces, this Al-Fahd advances forward after originally having been started to be engaged by this M1 before the M1 was totally destroyed by the helicopter-based anti-tank missiles that are being fired from the Chinese attack and armed recon helos in support of their operations. This is only one company out of the one Mechanized Infantry Battalion sent in the area. There's also the Combat Engineer Battalion, which is similar in a lot of ways in composition to the infantry as far as their combat abilities, their types of equipment they have. They have other types of equipment like assault bridge laying vehicles and mine clearing vehicles and things like that. They're perfect for disposing of obstacles and reconning areas, as that's generally a task that combat engineers excel in, as they normally go into a fortified area, demine it, take down, dismantle obstacles and fencing, and oftentimes they go into an area like that first and recon it and do those preliminary activities before a major assault can be carried out. But in this case, America doesn't have any minefields on its bordering its installations, and it hardly has any defensive types of fencing or anything, so the combat engineers, just like the mechanized infantry, just smashed their way in and did it fast, rapidly, under the cover of heavy artillery and missile strikes, loitering munitions as well, as the headquarters battalion of the 48th ID of the PLA was firing salvos of these CH-901A loitering munitions, as each TEL-like system had 48 tubes and could fire 48 of these at a time, and they had the option to be operator-operated or set to AI settings, which could pick their targets as priorities were set as per the AI targeting. As artillery began to come in and smash all these areas in conjunction with all of the different Iranian, Russian, and Chinese ballistic and cruise missile systems, over here there was very intense fighting, especially not so much in the south, but in the northern part of the sector here of the very front contact line, as these forces here were about to move into position to support their riflemen that were part of the rifle platoon in this area of the rifle company of their Cav Sqdn, which is a battalion of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division. There was this one tank company in the area here, and one of its platoons was operating right here. As these barracks buildings here weren't totally, as of yet, completely annihilated, the crossfire was beginning to pelt these buildings quite badly from the small arms fire, the Fahd APC's 40mm autocannons that were basically remote-controlled turrets by the gunner in the vehicle, as well as the 105mm main guns on the IFV versions blowing huge holes in the walls. These troops, at the time the map was shown, had already bounded from the rubble and made it here, and they were going around the side of the building in a line formation upon stacking against the wall, stacking one man behind another, as the whole squad leaned up against the wall and walked along the wall before the point man peered around and started firing. But by this point, this Bradley IFV was in a heavy duel with this Fahd IFV version. And the Fahd, while it was being hit by the 20mm, fired its 105mm and completely blew away the Bradley by the time it reached here, as it was rolling forward steadily and firing. But before even that happened, before it was totally destroyed when it got here, the dismounted squad right behind it had peeled off and entered this building. And as that happened, this APC with a rolling shield formation with its own infantry squad behind it had rolled up beside the building on this side with its rolling shield forces going in the building on this side. Heavy fighting was occurring within this barracks building, with men fighting each other on the 3 different floors, as well as throwing grenades and firing small arms, and it was vicious as this squad here held its position upon this having been destroyed. As up here, this Fahd, this one being an APC, was already being engaged by these M113 APCs with their turret gunners, their 50 cal gunners firing at it, and it was impacting while this was firing its 40mm cannon back and completely obliterated this one here and then this one. But by that time, its dismounted squad already went into this building, while this squad bounded and went in the building on this side. And again, there was fighting inside of this building. This building and this building had firefights going on literally within them. But the firefights were resolved, and as they were resolved, these squads bounded out here just as this tank was doing some serious maneuvering. And when this M1A1 tank went this way, and this one went this way. But as this rolling T squad from earlier got to the corner, it was taking fire from the turret gunner of this M1A2, and this squad broke in half. Again, 5 and 5. This 5 held this corner and fired at and kept the tank busy, while this other 5 bounded across the street to this rubble pile that used to be another large building and crept around, while their other half of their squad, they fired from around the corner at the tank, while the other half of this squad bounded. And what they ended up doing was, when the tank started to roll out to completely annihilate this squad, these guys here had an Alcaton, and they fired at the back of the tank and blew the entire back of the tank into flames as it basically hit the ammunition storage area and penetrated the armor there and just blew out the back of the tank and basically, for all intents and purposes, completely disabled it, while the other rest of the squad that came across checked the tank for any surviving crew and took some POWs and sent a man with 2 of the surviving POWs back to the casualty collection point and POW collection point, which was off the map with their headquarters who handled those affairs. And after accomplishing this, destroying this tank while up here, this squad bounded here and this tank was firing, and this squad were firing AT weapons at the tank, but the tank was not destroyed and turned around with its turret turned facing backwards, firing still at these squads. But because the squads were pressed up in good rubble positions, the tank gunner was unable to hit them and continued moving while being engaged from the back, while firing back, but again, being unable to hit these men because, again, they stayed relatively well concealed and would only pop out, fire, and then get back behind cover. The tank was being engaged, but not yet by anything that it couldn't deal with. When this squad had reformed up into a full squad, it bounded to this rubble pile here, right here, on the other side of this squad right here, that now bounded here, engaging the tank as it was now moving around this way, and it was firing back, but it wasn't really able to see them by that point because it was almost all the way around this rubble pile, by which point this squad went here, fired its Al-Qaton, and totally destroyed the tank, annihilated it. I mean, crippled it. It was just a smoking hulk of metal sitting there. So these squads worked together to basically defeat this tank here. And as that was occurring simultaneously up here in this area, these 2 tanks moved ahead, along with this infantry or rifleman squad here. These all 3 moved ahead together, the infantry to provide mutual support to the armor, and likewise the armor to provide support back. And the APC was firing its 40 mils just sitting back there, and this squad here, by the time these vehicles approached this rubble here and these troops, this squad lit them up with everything they had, along with this vehicle and this full squad, these 2 having already moved here. And this vehicle was lighting them up with everything they had, 40 mil, along with the squads firing their anti-tank weapons, their Al-Qatons and their Type 69 JICOM RPGs. And they were starting to wipe out these infantrymen, these dismounts, although there were some casualties. There were 4 KIAs and 3 WIAs amid this squad here. They took some moderate casualties of this squad, and the vehicle was badly damaged, but this squad here was able to get up into the rubble and fire its AT weapons down onto the roofs of the Abrams and finish them off. This was a savage battle with these hunter-killer teams going after these tanks. I mean, this was really nitty-gritty work and nitty-gritty combat. Their vehicles were there to help them fight off infantry forces and even lighter armored vehicles like American APCs and IFVs, but all in all, this wasn't easy. I mean, the Americans were definitely equipped for a fight. I mean, despite the fact that they were totally being overwhelmed by attack helicopters down here, the fact that they were being overwhelmed by IFVs and APCs firing, and the artillery of 300 millimeter rockets totally destroying whole companies as they saturated a 1.2 by 1 kilometer area, as well as missile strikes eliminating huge scores of troops as well that were running frantically around the installation, up and down its streets in chaos, and due to no communication, no proper coordination, no proper organization. You know, I mean, it was total pandemonium from a perspective of command and control. It was very difficult to gain control of the situation. So local NCOs and officers took initiative. They did whatever they could to try to fight back, but in the end it was all for naught because the drone directed artillery strikes, came in, finished off all these vehicles back here. This headquarters platoon here for the tank company. The platoon of riflemen, APCs, IFVs here. The tank platoons down here, the 2 tank platoons, were already wiped out by the attack helicopters. And, of course, the mortars were wreaking havoc behind the contact line here. The contact line all up and down this area here. It was a vicious, brutal battle. The CH-901A loitering munitions as well, in addition to the, ballistic and cruise missile strikes. I mean, it all ended up being too overwhelming to where this battle really and truly was mostly fought along the contact line right here in this area, and especially in the northern part. The rest of this was over in a matter of minutes, while this actually went on in the northern part for roughly 15 minutes. This was a 15-minute long battle all in all, from the very initiation of this map where this company rolls into this 1 kilometer by 1.5 mile part of the post, and all the artillery striking and missile striking and more artillery coming in here, all over this area, here as well. I mean, this battle lasted 15 minutes. And by the time all of the missiles were finished, all of the artillery had been called in, and the rocket artillery as well was finished, these forces moved in to occupy what remained of the installation within this area, followed up by more follow-up companies of their same battalion, as well as the combat engineers further south coming up from their sector and doing the same. This was a very, very brutal instance of very savage, up-close and personal combat as it related to the killer teams of these Pakistani Infantry Forces. The Pakistanis also had heavier forces in the area, but they were busy further to the north, along a different line of contact containing the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division. And there was also an intense tank battle fought up there as well. Not to mention one that was also fought slightly even to the north of just this main post area at the Biggs Army Airfield. Which all of these battles in the post and along its perimeter will be explored in following videos. So the casualties for the invaders, at least in this battle, were somewhat mild, but the Americans lost thousands of people. Even just in this 1.5 by 1 kilometer area, they lost scores of people, thousands. Because it wasn't just the several hundred troops in the area, there was also the families that lived on unbased housing. It was also the people that worked on the posts, like civilian employees that just happened to be there when all this broke out. I mean, there were thousands of people that were just wiped out in the initial missile, artillery, and rocket barrage, as well as ground forces and crossfire between them. There were also quite a few POWs taken by the Pakistanis, and they were treated humanely, and the ones that were captured were mostly wounded, including that tank crew whose surviving 2 troops were pulled out of the tank after it had the ammo rack blown out the back, from out the back by a Al-Qaton AT missile, or rocket rather. This was a vicious battle. And all the rest were as well, as these Trojan shock armies did indeed shock the defenders and shock them to a level that fractured their psyche. No one imagined, after all, that this could happen to America, that America could fall so rapidly and so easily, but it could. 4th generation warfare proved that it could. Within the installation and outside its gates in the city, all hell had broken loose. And although the other invasion prongs were far larger than this external invasion prong was, the fighting at this installation, being that it was a regular army installation, not a guard fob or guard installation, guard armory. This was an active duty an active duty installation. And these troops were oftentimes held to a higher standard in many cases in terms of their readiness, in terms of their equipment, their discipline, and they were totally overrun. Within minutes, savage missile barrages, artillery barrages, the tank barrages, helicopter barrages, loitering munition barrages, anti-tank system barrages, all of it, IFV APC fire. Even the infantry soldier had the power to wreak havoc with anti-tank missiles and rocket systems. Caused tremendous damage. This battle was a titanic but very short-lived battle. This battle here was 15 minutes long. So from the time these Trojan forces, these two battalions, left their CCP regime properties and went for the installation, crossed through the northern parts of El Paso and hit the outer perimeter and broke in, that was between 15 and 20 minutes to get there, and then another 15 minutes to crush these forces guarding this area within that main post area. Again, that map was only a tiny segment of the larger battle within the main post. It was just a 1 kilometer by 1 mile area. The main post was bigger with the combat engineers down here and the rest of the mechanized infantry here, and yet another armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion attacking the Biggs Army Airfield, where a whole other armored battalion of the 1st Armored Division's 2nd Brigade was. And that is a different battle as they smashed deep into the post and got to the airfield, as well as the fighting up north where the 1st Brigade was trying to break out and make for the mountains and the interstates, which absolutely could not be tolerated by the invaders, as it could potentially throw a wrench into their plans as far as their timing and their strict schedule they had to adhere to get the externals deep inland to support the Trojans that were already there doing the heavy lifting as their reinforcements. That could not be allowed, and it was unacceptable, hence the reason why the 14th Group Army's 144th Armored Division already went deep inland to Las Cruces, bypassing all the fighting being conducted by the PAP on the westernmost flank of this operation, and bypassing all the fighting going on at the installation and inside the city itself. They went straight for I-25 to secure it for the rest of the external forces of the 14th Group Army and 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade to follow behind them, as they would lead the convoy operation up I-25 to get to their ultimate objective, which was northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The next battle in the next video will be the battle at Biggs Army Airfield, followed by the two battles at the salient and the northern post, as well as the special operations mission carried out against local militia, high-value target, local militia leader and his inner core of his militia in the mountains, in the Rockies, as well as other PAP operations, such as their battle occurring at Deming as it was along I-10, a portion of I-10. This was a very large battle with many operations going on simultaneously, as shown. Again, it's very difficult to present all of this in a coherent type of order, as there's multiple things occurring simultaneously or near simultaneously. So I'm starting with all of the operations that began within the first hour and ended before hour 2. Which all of this, from the border battles in El Paso to the border battles at Columbus and these other border crossings, to the battles along the installation and within it, all of this began within hour number 1, and most of it was still going on into hour 2. And some of it didn't wrap up until hour 3, with the whole battle as a whole lasting only 5 hours and a half, 5.5 hours total. Next video will be the fighting at Biggs Army Airfield.